Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel-Schroeder.
Niall Howell lives in Calgary, Alberta, with his wife, sons, and pets. His debut noir novel, Only Pretty Damned, was shortlisted for the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Literary Fiction. His follow-up novel, There Are Wolves Here Too, was shortlisted by the Book Publishers Association of Alberta for Mystery and Thriller Book of the Year. Niall's short fiction has been featured in the Feathertail Review and Freefall. He is currently working on his third novel.
Today's guest, Niall Howell, and I have been friends for a very long time. We've known each other since undergrad. I was trying to calculate how long it's been, and I don't know. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I feel like we would have graduated in 2013, but I'd met you a few years before that. So I guess, yeah, probably like 14 or 13 years. Which is insane.
Right. I know. It's weird to think, actually. But yeah, so I've been reading Niall's work since undergrad. We used to exchange stories and things like that. And I've always been a big admirer of your work. And I guess one thing I forgot to tell you in advance is that this is actually a Sugar Ray trivia podcast. So that's okay.
Perfect. Oh, I would have studied up, but yeah, I'll do my best.
How do you go about balancing life and writing? How do you drop and pick up the thread? Is that an ongoing process? Like, what does the day-to-day craft practice look like for you?
I feel like the nicest way to put it is that it's an ongoing process. But yeah, it's quite a juggling act. I feel like you and I have spoken so much about our creative process and what a routine looks like so often over the years. And then when we had our kids, so for viewers or listeners rather, I have a 2.5-year-old and then a 1-year-old. When they came into the world, everything I thought I had locked down about my creative process just kind of went out the window. I've been really good at, I think, finding moments and then reevaluating how I go about things. And it's one of those instances where I didn't realize how fortunate I was to have the control over my routine and my process for the longest time until I didn't have that anymore, because kids don't care about when the best time of day is for me to write or any of that stuff. So yeah, it's been really interesting for someone like myself who's very much a creature of habit with this stuff. It's been an interesting few years for sure.
And then of course there's your work as a teacher as well. That's also a full workload. And I mean, you're an English teacher, so to some degree, the work informs the writing and vice versa. But I mean, I guess I have also been in the position of teaching and writing, and it does take a certain kind of energy to teach. And sometimes it can be difficult. Let's say you have a day where there are a couple particularly challenging classes to come home and do the writing work. Do you find that can be something that you have to navigate as well?
I wish I were able to hold them separate, and I'm not sure if this is your experience too, but it can sometimes, be the case that you are almost spent on talking, writing, or thinking in sort of literary anything by the time you come home and you actually get to a point where you can sit down and write. You guys have mentioned this on previous episodes of the podcast. I think sometimes the routine of writing is something that's very much glamorized and romanticized. Needs to be like these ideal conditions and the inspiration has to hit me and then I'll run to the desk and it'll all just pour out of you. I think in my experience, the reality of it is that there's moments where that does happen, but those are quite rare, and that you have to treat it as though it's work. It's very rewarding and fulfilling work, but like anything worthwhile, unless you forced yourself to sit down and accomplish something, whatever that looks like for one writer or another, the work's just not going to get done. So there's certainly been times with teaching where maybe we've had a really invigorating conversation in one of my classes and I come home inspired, and by the time I'm able to sit down and write, hang out with the kids and my wife and I will have dinner, and then by the time I can write, it might be like 10:30 or 11 p.m. And then knowing that I'm going to be getting up multiple times during the night with the kids as well. But, if it matters to you, you'll make time to sit there and be productive. I will say that productive means, it's very different, my definition of productive right now, than it would have been when I was writing my first novel. But right now, I've kind of minimized my expectations of myself. I'm still getting a decent amount of work done. It's just I'm moving, I think, comparatively at a bit of a snail's pace.
How frequently are you able to write? I ask because we were just discussing our vacation that didn't pan out, and I've been sick. I'm just getting over COVID. I feel as if I have taken almost a month away from a novel I'm writing. I know I'm the type of person who I need to write like practically every day, because if I have too much distance from it, it starts to like freak me out, and I feel as though I've lost touch with it. I don't know what it is. It's foreign to me. It meaning the manuscript. Like, it feels as if someone else wrote it. I'm wondering, like, because you have such a jam-packed schedule, do you try your best to make sure that doesn't happen, or does that affect you if you have to take, like, life gets in the way for a couple of weeks? Does that ever happen to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm experiencing some of that right now. So during the bulk of the school year, I was actually pretty good at writing, I'd say at least 3 or 4 nights a week, finding the time. I wasn't making strides in the writing, but I was still able to get like a few hundred words down every time. And then that being said, sometimes life right now just gets too busy. So I don't want to completely negate things that I just said earlier to the previous question, but you can make time to write, and you can try to be regimented about it and try to force these sort of like productivity quotas upon yourself, but sometimes it's just not going to happen, right? For better or for worse. So the thing that I'm dealing with right now is that I've taken almost a month off my novel, which is unheard of for me. And that was just winding down with the end of the semester, wanting to make sure that I was present for, family time and everything like that. And the writing kind of just got away from me a little bit. So I was still trying to read as much as I will, any evening. But it was really daunting. Actually, last night I sat down and, if you use like Microsoft Word, I don't know if either of you have found this, but it will always say pick up where you left off, and then it gives you the date. And when I saw the actual date, my heart just sunk, and I almost became intimidated then going back to my manuscript, which at this point I'm 320 pages into it. Like, I know the story that I'm writing, but it was just this sort of internal crisis of like, oh God, where do I pick up now? Do I even know this story? What am I going to do? And I almost started panic procrastinating, but it was like, no, I sat down, I'm getting back on the horse. I'm on summer break right now. So this is when I've really tasked myself with sorting out some of the kind of fine tuning that I've been putting off for a long time, but it does become sort of intimidating when life has other plans for you.
I know with your first 2 novels, and I believe with your third one as well, you have taken more of a quote unquote pantser approach, that you don't outline your novels in advance, which is really interesting to me because your first 2 novels are very structured. There is a real sense of architecture and of plot design. So I'm curious, I guess, well, A, how the pantsing approach is going this time around with your third novel. B, if you would consider outlining a novel again in advance, and C, what do you think are the benefits of taking a more kind of improvisatory approach to novel writing?
Yeah, from previous conversations that I'm a pretty devout pantser, but been thinking about this a bit recently. I feel like process is something that evolves almost sort of with style for writers. I still pants it, but there's always like a threshold. And what I've realized with the current novel that I'm working on is that I reach a point where the story becomes clear enough to me that I'm able to sort of come up with bullet points of things I need to do in order to finish the project. The thing that I love about pantsing is I love the spontaneity of it. I like that you get a very organic story out of it. But as I'm sure you'd recall as well, it means a lot of backwards work and a lot of editing to make everything gel and fit together. I feel like I'm somewhere in between a pantser and an architect. Is that the other analogy? Is it a pantser and or a gardener and an architect is maybe another way that people sometimes put it. I feel like I'm sometimes between those two. I'm really in love with just the spontaneity of writing. That being said, I feel like I'm constantly evaluating the effectiveness of the process, so I might be more inclined to do a little bit more structure for my next work. But I do really enjoy the pantsing. I just love the way that the story reveals itself to you and the way that those surprises come about. With There Are Wolves Here Too, which was my second novel, which Miriam, you just read, the extent of my planning was just that it was going to be a certain type of story, and the child goes missing, and my protagonist is one of the last people to see the child who goes missing, and that was literally it. That ended up being something that I think, compared to my first novel, Only Pretty Damned, is a little bit more of a conventional mystery. But figuring the story out as I went along was a joy. But to have something that was as cohesive as I think it ended up being, it meant a lot of editing. Very, very extensive editing. So that's one thing that I'm really, I don't know if I have a good answer for it, but I'm just evaluating right now, is just like the effectiveness of spending your time on one particular method versus, is there sort of a hybrid that I could find where I can still get that spontaneity that I enjoy so much, but at the same time maybe make it a bit easier on myself. I'm not sure how you two have found that in your own writing. Mike, if I'm remembering correctly from like even previous conversations and from stuff that's come up in other episodes of the podcast, you're doing a bit more of a structured like planning approach now.
Yeah, and I think I used to feel similarly to you in the sense that I thought there was a really innate, just like something fun about that sort of discovery process and of uncovering something as I went along. But what surprised me most about outlining this third novel is that I still tended to have those moments. And I think what I was afraid of with outlining a novel was that it would feel stiff and mechanical and preordained and cold. And I was quite surprised to find it wasn't like that at all. I still had just as much fun. And there were still many of those moments of discovery throughout. Things changed. Characters did things I didn't expect. Scenes moved differently than I had anticipated. But I still had that blueprint there so that I could course correct a little more easily. Whereas with my previous two novels, I hit walls at times. There were moments where I was like, I actually don't know what to do, and I have no map. I did not miss those moments. Surprisingly, there was nothing that I personally felt I missed in plotting, but I know that's not true for every writer. And I do agree with you that I think writing should be fun. It should always be fun. If it's not, I don't know why I would do it. Like, I can't think of a good reason to write if it's not fun.
Yeah, that's really reassuring, because I think that maybe one of my fears, or one of the reasons I'm a bit more apprehensive to try that more structured planning approach, is because I'm sure we've all read novels where the craft and the structure itself is sort of floating on the surface of the story. And when it's obvious, that just sucks the fun out of reading the story. And it seems like this sort of formulaic, calculated product versus something that maybe has a bit more artistic merit. Now, maybe that's just me being ridiculous, but that is my fear with it. So that's reassuring that it's worked for you. And I just wanted to emphasize as well the terror of being spontaneous and then writing yourself into some sort of horrible corner where you're like, how the hell do I get out of this? So there's either like so much backtracking, or one of the things that I find I'm notorious for in my own writing is having these sort of false epiphanies where you think you've untangled some sort of huge plot knot. It's almost like a dopamine hit, and you ride that high for all of 15 minutes and realizes that it causes like so many things that you've written prior to just crumble into nonsense. And then having that dopamine, whatever the reverse of that is, you're just like, downward spiral. So I don't know. Maybe I'm going to definitely give the plotting closer consideration after this, for sure. Miriam, are you much of a plotter?
I try to be. I think that for me, I don't know how to describe it. The things that I like the most in film and literature are a sort of atmosphere. And I think character is my greatest weakness. Neil, I actually was reading an interview between you and Mike where you were talking about how you kind of organically figure out what your character's motivations are, who they are, and that kind of pushes the plot along. For me, I think I'm trying to get to know my characters first and what they would do, but I think at the end of the day, I just like certain plot formulas. Like earlier today, I was talking to Mike about whether or not The Wicker Man is like a noir, and it just has a formula that has an atmosphere to it that I like. And so I kind of want to like plop in things I'm a plotter in that sense, also because I've just benefited from talking to all of you. It has been helpful to say, like, okay, this is my first novel. What best practices or lessons learned can I tease out? So I'm just a plotter because it feels safer. I don't have the experience to know any better. I care about atmosphere more than character, probably, but I do realize that character is what makes people read things. And I wonder, just because of that quote from that interview, Neil, like, is that a hindrance to you plotting too much, like getting to know your characters, or have I missed the mark?
No, that's a good question. I guess it's kind of tough to answer because I don't know how good I am at knowing my own blind spots. But I think, like yourself, I love tone and atmosphere so much. So I'd say that the things that dictate me even starting a story would be, like, first off, the tone and atmosphere, and then character. I feel like so much about character is revealed in the actual writing of the story, which again causes me to have to do so much backtracking to make sure that I at least have that sort of continuity with any particular character. And I think one of my concerns, the times I've sort of flirted with plotting too much in the past, has been just that I don't know if I can figure out the character's beats without really knowing the character. But that being said, I guess if you're plotting, it's not like you finish doing a story outline and then you have to, like, sign some sort of contract with the, like, literary gods saying that you will not deviate from this very strict guideline you've come up with, right? Like, it's not like you can't still have these moments of spontaneity that can change the course of a character. Maybe the character's actions reveal something about them that you hadn't considered in your plotting. So it feels like having that skeleton is actually something that could be really beneficial.
Who were your sort of gateway drug writers?
Yeah, if I were to go back to, like, my childhood, it would be, I mean, like, Goosebumps and Tolkien. From when I was very young, I was obsessed with that and Fear Street. When I started to really get into reading in my teens, it was Stephen King. I remember discovering Raymond Chandler when I was in my late teens, and that was a huge gateway writer for me. Chandler, James Ellroy. With Chandler, it really opened up my horizons, though, to pulp and noir writers of that era. So I really went into this deep dive of, like, Raymond Chandler, Dorothy B. Hughes, James M. Cain is another huge one, and Jim Thompson, who I know you're a fan of as well. I'm not sure how you two feel about this, but I think that those writers that you discover at that pivotal moment when you're sort of coming of age as a thinker even, and really engaging for the first time with writing in a way that maybe you hadn't before, those are the ones who really stay with you. So I find that even though I try to read a lot more broadly, and I don't think I'm just a tunnel vision reader by any means, I don't think I can ever truly tear myself away from that influence, which I think is why I write what I write.
I relate to that for sure. I think there's certain things that sort of become part of your DNA. They really do feel like gateway drugs. They're the first very activating experiences that form your creative cognition, and you can't unstick yourself from that. Like many of the writers who most influenced me, you know, some of them I haven't gone back to in decades, but I still feel them rattling around somewhere inside of me whenever I'm writing. I recently reread a few of Stephen King's classic novels, and I actually think my favorite might now be Salem's Lot, although it's difficult to pick one. I'm curious which of his books excited you the most. What were some of the first ones you read, and if you have a favorite?
Salem's Lot was actually where I started with Stephen King, and that's one that when I revisited it a couple years ago, like I read it when I was, I think, 17 or 18, and then I went back to it nearly 20 years later, and I loved it just as much, if not more. I was blown away by just the characterization, not just of his protagonist, but also all of the periphery characters in Salem's Lot. He creates such interesting characters that even if we're only with them for one chapter, by the time they've left, you feel their absence. That one guy who, like, lives in that junkyard and, like, shoots rats. I remember just, like, the way that he creates that whole persona, gives the character backstory in such an organic way, was something that really stuck with me. But Salem's Lot is a big favorite. I think that or It would be my all-time favorites. And then the short story collection, Night Shift, is one that I think is pretty flawless. I did just pick up that new collection he did. I love his short story collections. I just haven't had a chance to crack into it yet.
The kind of like lived in quality of his books, I think, was Even more so than the horror in many cases, I think was what first drew me in. They're so immersive. I think he's described Salem's Lot as Peyton Place with vampires. And in a way, it's true. It's kind of just like this portrait of a New England town. There are all these kind of dramas and micro tensions, micro narratives. And then he kind of brings in those genre elements, but they're not the primary focus or by any means the only focus. And I still need to read his new collection as well. I will get to it soon.
I feel like for new releases, I'm still 5 books behind because he releases so much. And then I don't want to be the guy who's just reading Stephen King all the time. So I read one and then I go read like 7 or 8 of a different author and then come back to him. But he's got an output that's very difficult to keep up with for sure.
Funny, I'm just a dabbler in Stephen King, but I can certainly see the influence on both of your novels that I've read. Maybe it's just because they're coming of age, Shelter for the Damned, and there are wolves here too, but I can definitely see that DNA. And I do think that what you read when you're younger really does stick with you.
With Wolves, it was a huge influence for sure. Just that sort of coming of age story that wasn't directed at the demographic that it's about, but that sort of retrospective, confronting the terrors of childhood thing that we saw in it was a huge influence.
Yeah, no, that really shows. And I was listening, Neil, to an interview with you in preparation for this interview. You were talking about how because you teach English to high school students, you're exposed to a lot of Bildungsromans, I guess. But also, it is such an immersive portrayal of adolescence in the mid-90s. So I'm just curious, if you could speak a little more about how you were able to channel or dredge up so many evocative details with regards to the era and of the adolescent experience. Only Pretty Damned is also steeped in post-World War II period details, and I believe your novel in progress is a period piece too. So what kind of resources do you draw upon? Memories in the case of Wolves, the internet, film? What have you done in terms of research?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, all of the above. Wolves was a bit different because I was the age that the protagonist in the book is during the late 90s when it takes place. So a lot of it was drawing upon my own memories. But I guess the consistent thing between the 2 novels and then the one in progress is I really just like to immerse myself in as much media from the time that I can possibly find. So I'll watch as much film as I can from that era. I'll try to read widely from whatever era I'm writing in, but also doing that while being cognizant of not wanting to imitate any of the writers that I'm reading. So yeah, a big one is film and then photographs. I love looking at photographs from certain eras. I find that can even be a great place to start if you're beginning a chapter or trying to set the scene. One thing I always struggle with is setting a scene and looking for the right sensory language to use to give that certain feeling of that whatever the tone is that I'm trying to create. So photos and visuals are something that can definitely always help. The other big one is movies. For eras that, Only Pretty Damned was unique because I was not, this might come as a surprise, alive during the early 1950s. With Wolves and then the piece I'm working on right now, which takes place in the late 80s, I at least have some frame of reference for being there during that time. But for Only Pretty Damned, I had to do a bit more of a deep dive into not just old films, but looking at a lot of historical research, documentaries. I read a lot of books on acrobatic and aerialist technique, a lot of circus books, not a fictional Toby Tyler Goes to the Circus, but books on just circus history and things like that, and then just sort of going through and picking and choosing the sort of details that you would want to bring to the story. The research is something that just can almost overshadow the writing itself. I found that I need to also know when to stop and just draw that line of, okay, I'm not saying I'm going to completely go cold turkey and not look at anything from this era while I'm writing it anymore. But I would like to actually focus on the creation of the piece, because if I wait until I'm a master of a historical, aficionado of whatever era I'm writing in, I'm just never going to get anything written. So just sort of knowing when to draw the line and say, okay, it's time to be productive now.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I relate to that. And we had an earlier guest, William Ping, who was talking about, he had a sticky note. You have everything you need. I mean, I think writers do find a lot of ways to productively procrastinate.
I don't know, I'm not accusing you of anything, but I do myself, I just want to be as well versed in something as possible in order to write. And it can be hard to not have imposter syndrome about that and to cut yourself off and just start writing.
So much of it too is just like you, on that note of imposter syndrome, is you want to have that authenticity in your work. Like, for example, with Only Pretty Damned taking place in the 1950s and not being a child of the 1950s, you worry that you're going to get something wrong that is going to just like take away that authenticity from your piece, right? Like forgetting that it's fiction and that you have creative license and you can really make it your own. I remember that episode with the Post-it note that says you have everything you need really stood out to me. I'm like, that's a pretty good idea. I should put that up somewhere in my office.
Totally. That's very relatable. I'm envious that both of you have written your kind of coming of age novels already. I feel like my own memory is too unreliable. And if I don't get my coming of age novel soon, then I'm just not going to remember that period of my life.
You've got plenty of time. Plenty of time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another thing Miriam and I were talking about is we recently both listened to an interview with Emma Cline about her most recent novel, The Guest, which is an incredible novel. Cline mentioned that close third POV is ideal for showing a protagonist who's unaware of their flaws. She says first person would ask too much of the character in terms of the knowledge that they would have about themselves. The reader would be too close, and that she needed a distance of close third POV in that novel. And I chose to use close third person POV in Shelter for the Damned for similar reasons. But I look at writers like you, Neil, and Jim Thompson, among others, and I do see a case for the classic noir, unreliable first-person narrator. I can't remember if you've told me what POV you're writing your current novel, and maybe you haven't. Are you writing this one in first-person, third?
No, I'm out of my comfort zone in this new one. I'm writing in third because I actually have 6 different characters. So the new piece is sort of 6 intersecting narratives. Takes place in Calgary in the late 80s, and I'm completely out of my element because I'm so used to first person. I think first person sometimes gets flack that I don't fully understand because some of my favorite novels are written in the first person. And I think it can, to your point, Mike, sometimes have to do with genre, identifying, as you did, the unreliable narrator that you, I think, need for a certain type of noir piece. First person has just been the obvious choice for me with my first couple of books. If you do it right, it's almost more immersive, right? But of course, it depends on the scope of your story, right? Like it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell. But I love first person. Third person can be hard, though, because you also just don't want to sound repetitive, right? When I have like so many different POVs, I have 6 different POVs, and you have characters who, even though it's a third person narrator, there's certain like phrases that would only come up with one character versus the other one. So just making sure that I'm not getting my wires crossed too much has been a little bit of a challenge, but that's something I'm hoping to work out over the course of the summer here. The uphill battle that I have ahead of me here.
That's interesting what you mentioned about first person, because in reading There Are Wolves Out Here Too, Robin, the protagonist, kind of, maybe I'm stretching a little bit, but kind of reminded me of the sort of outsider protagonists of, say, The Great Gatsby, or if you've read The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Kind of a spectator. It's not like the main action is happening to that character. Of course, a lot of action is happening with Robin. He's unfortunately getting beat up a lot, but there is this, I guess, when it comes to first person, if you think of a character who's more on the fringes or like watching things, and especially with mystery, trying to unpack, I mean, the detective is kind of outside the action too, I suppose. So do you find that too, Mike? Have you come across like that there's a little less respect for first person?
I'm not sure if I've noticed a disrespect. When I teach like introduction to literature, I always think it's important to bring in some pieces that are written in the first person, because there are so many things that you can do with first person that you can't do with third. Edgar Allan Poe's story is written in the first person, like The Black Cat is an excellent example. That story just cannot exist in the third person, or certainly not in anything like the context that it currently does. There's Gatsby, you mentioned. Moby Dick is written in the first person. It just depends on the material. I mean, nothing is better or worse than anything else. It just depends what the material needs, basically, is my point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of complaints, I've heard sometimes that people think first person is easier. And I'm like, I don't think there is an easier one or the other option, right? Like, it depends on what you're doing with it. But I just find that it really gives you that closeness to the character. It's fun writing in first person, and I still feel weird. I'm getting used to now writing in third person, because this other one I've been working on, I've been chipping away at for a couple of years, but it definitely took a while for it to feel normal for me, because I don't think I've ever really written in third person.
I find there are some technical challenges with first person that you definitely don't have with third, like the dilemma of how do you show something from the first person is a lot more technically tricky, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's much easier to tell from a first person point of view what you're experiencing. And I mean, the show don't tell dictum is like many dictums. It doesn't always apply, or it's often kind of misapplied or kind of grossly oversimplified. But I do think there are certain challenges that come with first person that you don't get with third. I think each style has its own shortcomings, challenges, etc.
No, totally. I think for third person as well, the show don't tell dictum, it can be hard to do that in third person in a way that feels natural and organic, and not just saying like the character felt this. So I feel like that sort of subtlety is something that can be a little bit more challenging in the third person.
Miriam was talking about the role of the detective in fiction. Only Pretty Damned, I would say, from my point of view, is a noir gothic novel. I don't know if you would take issue with that description. I would say there are elements of noir in There Are Wolves Here Too. I kind of wanted to pick your brain about a genre question. If you could help me better understand the distinction between noir fiction and hard-boiled detective fiction. Are there like key texts that would exemplify one but not the other?
That's a tough one. We've chatted about genre before, and then Randy Schroeder, he always has so many great insightful things to say on this too. I think for me at least, okay, let me back up. Before I talk about genre, it's always going to be splitting hairs, and I quite like genre. I like sort of racking my brain over the distinctions of one type of art versus another, whether it's in film or music or literature, right? Just what makes this noir versus hard-boiled fiction. For me, and just my opinion, I think it has to do with the tone of the piece. And there's certain, I think, tonal and atmospheric things that we would see in noir that we wouldn't see as much in detective fiction. And it has to do with a lot of the themes that come up. So I think bleakness, I think having that sort of unreliable narrator who is on some sort of a downward spiral, whether they know it or not. And I think you need to have that element of fatalism as well. Whereas I don't think that's the case as much in detective fiction. And I think in writing There Are Wolves Here Too, in my mind, it's sort of like a coming of age noir with, I think, a bit of horror thrown in. But I think I accidentally wrote something that's sort of, you know, on the cusp of detective fiction because there is that sort of mystery element to it. Generally, I like the sort of chaos and the sort of like nihilism of noir more than I like a conventional detective story, though. I like things sort of spiraling out of control, and there's that sort of loss of agency that I think is another characteristic of noir. Whereas in detective fiction, I think the worst of detective fiction is when the story itself turns into a puzzle that it feels like it's the reader's responsibility to try to solve. And then you sometimes talk to readers after the fact, and they have that sort of like, aha, I figured it out before the end, right? I feel like that sort of detracts a little bit from the merits of the story to some degree. So I think that's sort of a fine line to straddle with detective fiction. I think as well, like the unreliable narrator and that sort of element of fatalism too. I feel like in detective fiction, you usually have more redeemable qualities from your protagonist, where I think noir is often an exploration of these more sort of debased human emotions. And it's often the case that the narrator, or sorry, protagonist rather, they're less than who they are when they started, right? They've been forced to confront some sort of a dark truth about human existence or about their own existence. And this confrontation has left a mark on them, right? They're not motivated as much by justice or truth, right? That where a detective might be. But it's more so like the confrontation of these sort of uglier parts of life, right? Which I think is why it actually works really well with coming of age stories. And maybe that's where that sort of intersection happened a little bit with There Are Wolves Here Too, was the fact that you're forced to confront something about the world around you and your part in that world, right? The sort of ugliness in the world surrounding you. And that's something that after it's stripped away, you can't get it back. I feel like that's a feature of the coming of age tale as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it works so well intertwining coming of age with noir. It's rather genius. I'm like just dipping my toes into noir more lately. I only recently discovered that there was a distinction between detective and noir, but did read Save the Cat by, is it Jessica Brody? She talks about like the detective or the mystery, I guess mystery. Oftentimes there's a beat in a mystery, regardless, especially if the protagonist is not a detective, wherein there's like a dark turn, I think she calls it. So kind of similar to what you're talking about, Neil, wherein someone might have to do something against their principles, do something unscrupulous in the name of a compulsion towards the truth. And that is like a turning point. I don't know if that resonates. My issue with detective fiction sometimes is it's someone doing their job, I guess. Like, I don't want to read about somebody doing their job if it's personally. Like, they're showing up to work, and that's not as interesting to me, I guess.
I love so much detective fiction, but I think that sometimes when it's not done well, the character's fatal flaw can be something that sort of takes away from the complexity of the protagonist. And I think that that can be a tricky thing to navigate because it's a genre that has been done so many times over the years. And there's times that people are great with it, but then there's other times where that sort of dark turn or fatal flaw can fall a little bit flat. And I don't know if I'm the person who knows how to do that. I just know when it's done well, it's very impressive.
That's an interesting observation, though, because going off our earlier conversation with noir versus detective fiction, to me, detective fiction, especially when it is not fully succeeding or succeeding in the ways that we might find interesting, it almost becomes the opposite of noir then, because noir is about the muckiest things about human experience and human subjectivity, like just the suffering of inhabiting a mind and a body, whereas detective fiction, I guess, in many cases is about conquering that.
I think the best depictions of detective fiction that I've seen is when the struggle is for the protagonist to hold on to some semblance of their humanity in the face of these sort of corrupting forces that are encroaching upon them. When it's done well, that's what it is. I think noir can be a lot more confrontational. And I think that it also has a more existential element to it as well. And even if, like, I guess maybe I'm being a little bit of a hypocrite here because I'm talking about Raymond Chandler, but Raymond Chandler wrote detective fiction that I think was also noir fiction. But a lot of his stuff, I think the reason that it resonated is because it had that sort of like existential element to it where his protagonist is forced to confront these dark truths, and if he comes out okay on the other side, he's a changed person because of it. There's a really good, I guess I wouldn't call it a biography of Chandler, but there was a publication of his letters that came out a few years ago that talked about this, and I guess that a lot of his work resonated with people like Camus and other people who were very obsessed with like existentialism during that time. Like, it resonated a lot more with European authors than it did with American authors who saw what he was doing as sort of not schlock, but just sort of like, yeah, you're another detective fiction guy. We got it.
We've talked about before, I think, how Jim Thompson has now kind of been labeled the dime store Dostoevsky. He's grappling with a lot of the same hefty existential themes, just within a different genre, framework, or context. And I just recently read, I'm curious if you've read it as well, Neil, Devil in a Blue Dress, the Walter Mosley novel. I do think it also has some of that Raymond Chandler kind of existential dread. There's a lot of fascinating class and race critique built into the novel as well. These are just very muscular genres that can do things that other genres can't. And that's how I like to think of genre, is as a tool, not as a constraint, but as something that can be used to do things that other genres cannot.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always tried to make sense of why a writer like Thompson, for example, would be someone who people roll their eyes at during their life, but how we're able to realize that they're tackling this complex stuff after they're gone. And I almost wonder if the accessibility of Chandler or Thompson is what ended up kind of damning them in that regard, where it's if something's accessible and we're able to tap into it, we don't view it as maybe tackling these complex elements of the human existence in the way that we're used to seeing them tackled. I'm not really sure. Totally unfair to those writers, but yeah, I'm not really sure. I think just like being aware of the characteristics and tropes of a genre, not being limited by them, but just being aware of them and knowing then that you have this sort of fun playground where you can subvert and flip things on their head. I think that's the fun of writing any sort of genre fiction.
Oh, certainly, I agree. And like you were saying earlier, where we were talking about, there are wolves here too. It's interesting to blend coming of age, which I do think is a genre, usually has certain specific beats, with noir. I mean, I've always liked mystery, but since thinking about noir more, I alluded to earlier with my novel that I'm writing now, which is kind of folk horror, I am interested in The Wicker Man. I love the movie, and it is to me kind of...
I mean, both movies. I have a soft spot for the Nicolas Cage one as well. The original is unbeatable, but yeah, those are both fantastic movies.
I too love the Nicolas Cage one as well. They both have their own charms, respectively. Mm-hmm. And I do think that they both are kind of noir, like they do have kind of like a femme fatale element, and there is a detective, and the detective is tortured. So all this to say, I think even finding the nexus between two genres and kind of blending the elements that fit together can be really fun.
That's sort of loss of agency as well. I've never thought of The Wicker Man in that way, but you're identifying it that way. I mean, makes perfect sense. I think that all of those things, it's sort of, like a noir horror. Yeah, there's almost that in terms of atmosphere, that just sort of like otherworldliness almost of it too. The like murkiness when you go, I forget what the island is called, but going over there and just having that sort of loss of agency, right? And the protagonist is an authority figure who's over there to do his job, but the way that authority matters less and less, is almost treated as a joke by residents, is something that I think is very interesting and very noirish.
Yeah, I mean, the folk horror element, it's all about like he's Christian, a Christian detective going to a pagan world, but it's such an inversion of what he's used to and where he has authority. So that's a great point. And yeah, he's also very much like a patsy, I suppose. I was really enchanted by the whimsy and menace of the ravine setting in There Are Wolves Here Too. The eerie sentience of this setting reminded me of some books that I've read recently that I've really enjoyed. There's a 70s suburban chiller called The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons, a favorite of Stephen King's. There's also what some people think Stephen King ripped off with The Shining, Burnt Offerings by Robert Marasco. Just these spaces that feel kind of hungry. But specifically, the ravine was just so interesting because it's just like on the outskirts of this suburban place, and it's both enticing to the children, or the youths rather, but also very menacing. What does the ravine mean to you, and how did you come up with this idea? And can you think of examples of similar devices from other narratives?
Writing the ravine scenes were some of my favorite to write in the book. For me, it was just something that was emblematic of childhood fear, and that sort of like irrational fear, belief in the supernatural. I think having that stripped away is part of the coming of age experience. I think everybody has an analog for that in their own lives, where there was maybe that space that you and your friends went to as a kid, where the appeal of going there was the fact that it just felt sort of strange and dangerous. And you went there with sort of like a feeling of apprehension, but it was sort of like the fun of being scared. One of my inspirations for the book was the baseball diamond in the Sandlot, this sort of like mystical place. I do think everyone has that sort of childhood place where they were drawn to it because it felt dangerous and foreign. And it's usually, I find, a place of nature or some like abandoned space. I don't know if you guys had anything similar growing up, but we certainly had those when I was a kid. There's a ravine right by our house right now. We live in Strathcona in Calgary. And one of the things my wife and I like most about it is there's a very close by ravine to walk through. And especially during summer, we walk through there pretty much every day. It's like a nice half-hour walk. And whenever we're there, we're just taken aback by how you feel like you're not even in the city anymore. It's just like a nice green space that is beautiful, but weirdly unsettling, because it's like we were in the city when we entered, and now we're just, pushing our stroller over twisted roots and trying to get back onto the little boardwalk path that leads through the forest. It's just really, it's enjoyable. Nice place to walk and do some thinking.
I can relate to what you're describing. I think one of the things that was the impetus for Shelter for the Damned was that there was a storage shed near my elementary school that I and maybe some other kids had developed this really scary mythology around, and somehow we convinced ourselves that like a gorgon or a serial killer or someone lived inside of it, and we always saw it from a distance, and it developed this dark mystique. So I can relate to that.
That's awesome. I love that. And that's such a thing to do in childhood and adolescence, though, is to like create your own mythology to a particular place. I don't know if you and your friends did this, but my friends and I would, in certain spaces, find ways to freak one another out by like adding to the mythology. Sort of like when you weren't here the other day, that thing moved right before you showed up. And then that sort of makes it a scarier place, and you end up freaking yourself out in the process. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. That's awesome.
That is awesome. I wish I was more into King than I am. King is great, but I grew up reading Greek myths. Maybe my parents were too highbrow, and that was my problem. All this to say that one thing that really strikes me about King that I really like, even if I was never a teen boy, is this kind of modern mythology. Like, it's not the Greek or Roman or whatever pantheon. It is closer to urban legends or to folk tales, specific to location. So that's fun. That kind of what you were talking about, Mike, with the shack, and what you were talking about too, Neil, with embellishing on these kind of sacred adolescent spaces.
Yeah, and I do remember, Mike, in Shelter for the Damned, just the sense of space when they are in the shack. It felt like something that maybe you were drawing on a particular place that you had visited. I just remember the details being so real. Wonderful. Miriam, are you from New Brunswick originally?
Yes, I am.
Because I've never been there, but I mean, I've seen photos that Mike has shared, and it looks like a place that, at least compared to Alberta, looks so much more like otherworldly. It almost looks kind of like New England. I've seen these beautiful photos with like thick fog and these beautiful forests, and I wondered if there was something, and I'm putting you on the spot here for sure, but something about New Brunswick that sort of had its own kind of mythology of that sort.
Certainly. I mean, purely in terms of geography, I mean, the Atlantic Ocean is almost black looking compared to the Pacific is often, bluer in tint. And there is a lot of fog. There's a lot of trees. It's more rural, I suppose. There's a certain sublime, which I think I was thinking about while you were talking about the ravine. Yeah, just a sense of awe and fear and beauty. I went to McGill, and I used to enjoy doing weed oil and going to the I think it was called the B. So I did a library degree, so I think it was the BFs, like in the Library of Congress or the Dewey Decimal System, whatever. But that was like the parapsychology section, kind of like paranormal things, and just like kind of, be a little wavy gravy looking at these spines. I mean, I guess that Montreal is East Coast, but like the ghost stories were all like exclusively like the Atlantic. There's just something about the Atlantic. People are more superstitious, I find. Like people really do believe there's something spooky going on here, I'd say.
Totally. It looks it in the best way possible. Anytime Mike has shared a photo, I'm like, wow, I really want to go to that part of the world. It just looks like beautifully spooky.
Well, you and your family are welcome to visit anytime.
Sweet. So. Awesome. We'll be right there.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the entire New England Gothic tradition, most of the major American pantheon of Gothic and horror writers is from New England region. Like there's Poe, Lovecraft, Hawthorne, Shirley Jackson, Stephen King, the list goes on and on. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, Neil, is if you've ever received a piece of writing advice that has really stuck with you. It could be for better or for worse.
Okay, there's so much I could say here. One was I remember meeting with a university prof who's a mentor of sorts, Richard Harrison, who was like my honors supervisor. And that was a course that Mike and I did together. We were both in the same honors cohort, and Richard is a really accomplished poet. And I remember meeting him for drinks a couple years after I'd graduated. And it was shortly after my first book had been picked up by New West Press. And I was excited about it, but worried that because I was going to start teaching, I wouldn't have the time that I used to have for writing. And Richard said the most reassuring thing, which was just that you find time for the things that matter most to you. So he said, I mean, life is going to keep happening around you, but if it matters to you to continue writing, you're going to find time to write regardless of what's happening, which especially given all of the wonderful turmoil that I have in my life right now. And I don't say that ironically, but I love so much having kids, but they're just total maniacs. They're so much fun, but they're little maniacs. Just reminding myself that, you still find time for the things that matter. I'm really bad at right now thinking of who's given me this advice, but I know that treating it like it's something that you need to work at, I think has always been something that's really important to me. And I'm not sure if that's something that I read from King or if someone had told me that, but it's just really important to stay productive. And sometimes work feels like work, but if it's something you enjoy, it's rewarding in the long run.
Speaking of work, obviously writing takes a lot of time and effort. And something that I noted in There Are Wolves Here Too is that it has some excellent, what I would call set pieces. Scenes at the mall, the co-op, grocery store, and the public swimming pool draw on temporal and geographical setting to great effect. They're bursting with pop culture references, memorable walk-on roles, and site-specific action that definitely moves the plot along. I just recently started working on a scene of this ilk, and I'm intimidated by the amount of work I'll have to sink into it to stick the landing. And how much time and effort did these scenes take for you to complete?
Those are some of my favorite scenes to write, are those ones that take place in mall, swimming pool, ravine again. And I think in that book in particular, I'm drawing on some sort of childhood memory. So one of the fun things about writing this one is if I were to set the scene in a mall or when I'm setting it in the swimming pool, rather than being beholden to actual real life geography, I just made up like my own little satellite suburb for Calgary. When I was imagining what I wanted these spaces to look like, I would take elements of certain childhood spaces and bring them together. So like the mall, for example, I'd go like, okay, I'd really like the upper floor to be sort of like this food court in Westbrook Mall, but then maybe you have like this escalator from South Center Mall that leads down to this parking lot that I have something in mind like Chinook Center or something like that. It was the same with the Blockbuster as well. Remembering the Blockbuster that I always used to loiter in when I was a teenager, and then just sort of tweaking it where it was convenient. I had a lot of fun with those particular scenes, and that's something that for me is really enjoyable writing. Those sort of, I almost view them as like slow, like panning shots. If we're thinking in filmic terms, these sort of like panning shots to establish where the action's taking place, but it's fun to just bring in as much detail as you feel you can get away with when you're drawing on something that's familiar.
That's relatable. I'm setting my novel on an island loosely based on a place called Minister's Island in New Brunswick, but the joy of writing fiction is picking and choosing things from other places, making a composite map or geography based on the things that I love. As an aside, malls in the 90s are so almost psychedelic on some level, so what a thrilling setting.
I did want to have that in there just because it was sort of a thing to do, was to go and loiter at a mall. And if there was a mall with an arcade and you're a teenager, that's where you're probably spending like half your day in the summer. I think that the function and the space of a mall right now is something much different. But at the time, I feel like it was kind of a cultural rite of passage to go loiter at the mall if you were a teenager. Like you would go there with enough bus fare and then like enough to play like a few rounds of whatever at the arcade and then maybe get like an Orange Julius and then that was it. but you could spend half your day there. And I mean, it's as much about actually going there and playing arcade games as it is about like people watching and worrying about like bullies and other things like that. It was a very strange time to be alive.
And the same would go for swimming pools too. I wonder if you went to the same one. I used to go to Southland Leisure Center. Did you go there, Neil?
I loved that one. The thing I remember about Southland Leisure Center is that one of the eating areas was right underneath the stairs leading up to the water slide. So
yes,
you'd be
the
sitting
red
there.
slide.
Yeah, you'd be sitting there eating like a giant Texas donut, and water would be like falling off of people's bodies onto your donut, and you're like eating it as quickly as you can because it's gross, but you paid $5 for it. You're like, yeah, yeah. Southland was great. Yeah, wave pool.
Oh, such a vivid, like that's one of the most vivid spaces of my childhood. So
Yeah.
I loved that scene in your novel because it brought that, I don't know, the sound, the smell, the textures of that place. There's something very vivid about that. So
Yeah, I really loved writing that scene. There's been a couple people who've told me that that particular chapter is their favorite in the book. I guess I didn't know it was a thing to have a favorite chapter, but if they're saying that, I'll take it just because I love that wave pool scene so much.
It might be Mike's favorite chapter. Yeah, it kept asking me if I had read the pool scene yet. So, yeah. No, I loved it too. And I agree with you, Neil. I think that there was these kind of slow pan, almost like a Hieronymus Bosch. They're so packed with detail and they're really effective.
Thank you. I'll take it.
Is there an element of writing that you struggle with the most?
I think that for me, it's probably description. And I really like description, but sometimes it can be challenging knowing what sort of a balance to strike. Maybe this is part of being a pantser, but sometimes I need those reminders of, okay, we need to move the story forward. And I can sometimes get hung up a little bit on description, which is something that can be painful sometimes having to cut it. Like I remember with Wolves in particular, there was a scene you might remember that takes place in the Blockbuster parking lot. And we cut, that's like 1/4 of what the scene originally was. It was much, much longer. And I had them sort of going back into the video store. And I find sometimes with description, I just get carried away. And I wonder if sometimes on some subterranean level, I even know that I'm rambling and that it will be cut anyway, but it's painful to have to cut it sometimes once I've committed to it. So I think that, and then I do sometimes struggle with characterization. I think the same way that any author would. It's just that sort of desire to figure out who your character is and making sure that you're doing them justice. Like this choice makes sense for my character, this one doesn't, right? Sort of knowing when to, I guess, kind of let the character take the lead once you have that sense of who they are.
you were talking about how much you enjoy description and writing immersive settings. Would you say that's your favorite part of the process?
Yeah, I think it's probably that. When it's something like that and I can get carried away with it, that's probably the part that I enjoy the most.
Character is probably the thing that I struggle with the most. I know some people use composites. They think of people in their lives. Other people, like I often go to my Letterboxd, like where I log film and try to think of characters from film to try to mold together. What is the germ of, or the seed of a character for you? Where does it begin and how do you kind of like make them fleshed out enough to be real to you?
Sometimes I might draw on details from either real life or film, but they're usually things that aren't like defining a character. I'm not really sure, to be honest. I don't know if I've got a decent answer for that won't sound like bullshit. I'm just not really sure. I just reach a point where I'm like, okay, I think I know who this character is. There's a character in There Are Wolves Here Too, Dylan, the best friend who, I might draw in real life by having him wear like a backwards baseball cap, and being able to rock it in a way that some people don't think that they can. But it's usually anything that I think is essential to the character. I actually don't know where that comes from.
Sometimes it's just a feeling. You get to know the character through the writing, how they respond to certain things. There are a couple key scenes in the novel I'm writing now where I finally realized, oh, that's who this person is. Sometimes they announce themselves immediately. Sometimes I find it isn't until midway through the first draft that it clicks. And then, in the editing, you massage things out before that. Or for me anyways, it's kind of like this ineffable thing. It's you just sort of feel it or you don't.
Yeah, I think that's more what it is for me, is that sometimes an exercise in patience is waiting for it to actually click, and then knowing that you might have to do some backtracking and editing to make it all cohesive. But I think that's what it is more so for me. I'm also always worried about people seeing some element of themselves in any particular character, so I'm usually cognizant of avoiding that. I have recently, with the piece I'm working on right now, started to imagine almost like a casting for the characters. Like if I were to choose, what does this character look like? Oh, okay, so-and-so from this film or from that thing or whatever. But that's more so for physical description and things like that. That's about as far as I'll go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess that's what I do. I'm always paranoid that I have that, I know there's a medical term for it, but I can't remember what it is, like that I'm unable to really picture things in my head in a very clear way. So I do find it helpful to cast, like you said, Neil. Currently have like Kristen Stewart and like Giovanni Ribisi, like, because they're actors, they're malleable enough that they can play roles. So I'm like, okay, these actors are playing these roles in my head so that I can actually like picture someone leaning against the door as opposed to some kind of nebulous, vaporous mist.
Yeah.
It's like a trick of the mind, I guess, to get you in that flow state. Because you both are right. Like, you can't really pinpoint where a lot of writing comes from. It just is kind of magical or ineffable experience.
I'm the same way. Like, I find I can describe spaces better than I can describe people oftentimes. So sometimes imagining a certain actor, actress, whatever in that role can help, especially with like facial expressions and things like that. I find that it can be helpful to have a particular person in mind.
Alice Munro once said that writers should, quote unquote, know their canvas. They should know their own range and stick to it. Are there any writers whose work you've read and thought, damn, I wish I could pull that off, but don't necessarily think or believe that you could?
Knowing who you are as a writer is just having confidence in being okay with, this is my niche and I'm okay being here for now. That doesn't mean that it can't shift or expand in some way. There's so many books. One that comes to mind would be Timothy Findley's The Wars. A lot of what Timothy Findley's done, I'm just so blown away by it. And the amount of layering and complexity he can fit into what is usually a relatively short novel is always very impressive to me. Megan Abbott as well, who's one of my favorite authors of all time. She's the author who, when she has a new book out, I'm buying it day one and reading it right away as well. And I'm just so blown away by her use of language, her characterization. She just seems to have such a firm grasp on this sort of gothic noir coming of age sort of niche that she's carved out for herself. And it's something that I might be able to take inspiration from, but I don't think I could pull it off the way that she does. Which is fine though, right? Like, that's the joy in reading. You can be inspired by and you can be in awe of other authors and not try to emulate them at all because they have their wheelhouse and you have yours. There's many, many, many authors who I read and I'm just like, yep, I couldn't do that. Your work, honestly, would be similar. Schroeder's as well. Just like everyone has that thing that they can do really well. And I think more than anything else, it's just very inspiring to see that. And that makes you kind of want to perfect the thing that you're doing. And then just also be comfortable in the space that you've carved out for yourself. It was very inspirational.
I feel inspired for sure. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, that the feeling is mutual. A question that we always ask our guests at the end is whether you've read anything recently that has particularly excited you.
Yeah, there was a book I started a few days ago called Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. It's sort of a cool gothic horror. It's got a very satanic looking cover. I thought Mike Thorne when I saw it. I'm only about 100 pages in, but just the sense of space, the language in it is just really beautiful. I can't put it down. And then I just read a book called A Rage in Harlem by Chester Himes. And it's noir from, I think, the late 1950s, although I might have to fact check that exact date. It's really interesting. It's really tragic, and it's got a lot of wonderful social commentary in it. And at the time, it is this sort of absurd comedy of errors. And I tore through that one a few weeks back. I loved that one. Chester Himes had been a blind spot for me for sort of classic noir authors. So he was a great discovery, and I'm looking forward to reading some more by him. Another author who I've read his last 2 books 3 times each, and I've just finished my 3rd reading of his most recent book, is William Boyle. So his last couple works, one was called Shoot the Moonlight Out, and then prior to that, City of Margins. They're just these fantastic ensemble pieces, sort of intersecting narratives, crime stories that take place in the 90s and early 2000s, and they're just really brilliant. And I've been blown away by his characterization, which is why I've read them so many times recently. I'm just trying to make sense of how he just nails it as well as he does. They have that sort of spontaneity to them as well that makes me think if he's a plotter, he is the most like pantsy plotter. Imagine. I'm trying to make sense of just how he writes it.
Have you been keeping up with the recent James Ellroy at all? It seems like he's writing,
Busy.
like he's busy these days. Yeah.
I read Widespread Panic, and it was great. And I'd read Perfidia, but I didn't read the one that came after that, This Storm. I haven't read that one yet. They're wonderful, and, I love James Ellroy. I just have to be in the right mood if it's one of his, 700-page historical novels. But Widespread Panic was wonderful.
Where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Niall Howell. And for now, that is the only place online you can find me.
Neil's work is fantastic to all our listeners. They should go out and buy and read and review everything they can find by him. Only Pretty Damned and There Are Wolves Here Too, both excellent novels. And it sounds like there's a 3rd one coming.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, you guys too. It's been great chatting with you too.